The dust-choked Main Street of St. George, Utah Territory, seemed to hold its breath as Sarah Jane Morrison clutched her carpetbag tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs while the stagecoach driver's face turned an alarming shade of crimson. "I said no, and I mean no," Horace Griggs spat, his thick mustache quivering with indignation. "This here coach is full, and even if it weren't, I wouldn't be hauling the likes of you nowhere." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The August sun beat down mercilessly on her dark hair, making the weight of her bonnet feel suffocating. She had walked 3 miles into town this morning with the last of her savings clutched in her hand, desperate to reach Salt Lake City, where a teaching position awaited her. Now this man stood between her and everything she had worked toward. "Sir, please," she tried again, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor threatening to break through. "I have the fare right here. I need to reach Salt Lake City by Friday. I have a position waiting, and if I miss my arrival, they will give it to someone else." "Should have thought about that before," Griggs muttered, turning his back to check the luggage strapped to the roof of the Concorde coach. The other passengers inside peered out through the leather curtains with varying degrees of curiosity and discomfort, but none moved to intervene. Sarah swallowed hard. She knew exactly what Griggs meant by his cryptic remark. Her father's debts had become the talk of the territory before his death, 6 months prior. Marcus Morrison had been a dreamer, always chasing the next opportunity, the next fortune just around the corner. Instead, he had left Sarah with nothing but shame and a mountain of angry creditors who seemed to believe she should somehow pay for his mistakes. She had sold everything. The house, the furniture, even her mother's wedding ring, God rest her soul. The teaching position in Salt Lake City was her last chance at a respectable life, a fresh start where nobody knew the Morrison name or its tainted legacy. "The coach is not full," Sarah said more firmly, straightening her spine. "I can see at least 2 empty seats." "Those are reserved," Griggs said without looking at her. "For whom?" "For paying customers who don't come from families of thieves and swindlers." The words hit her like a physical blow. Several townsfolk had stopped to watch the exchange, and Sarah felt their eyes on her like hot brands. Heat flooded her cheeks, part embarrassment, part fury. "My father's debts died with him," she said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain composed. "I had nothing to do with his business dealings. I have money for passage, earned honestly through my own work. You have no right to refuse me service based on something I had no part in." Griggs finally turned to face her fully, his expression cold. "I have every right to refuse service to anyone I see fit. This is my coach, and I say you do not ride. Now get along before I have the sheriff remove you for causing a disturbance." Sarah opened her mouth to argue further when a deep voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "How much is her fare?" Every head turned toward the speaker. Sarah found herself looking at a man she had never seen before, though that alone was unusual in a town as small as St. George. He stood just outside the general store, one boot propped on the wooden porch, his hat tipped low enough that shadows obscured much of his face. But she could see a strong jaw, tanned skin, and an easy confidence in his posture that suggested he feared neither man nor beast. He wore typical cowboy attire, nothing fancy. A worn leather vest over a blue cotton shirt, dark trousers tucked into scuffed boots, and a gun belt that sat comfortably on his hips. He was tall, perhaps over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of build that came from years of hard work. "This is none of your concern, mister," Griggs said, puffing out his chest. The stranger pushed off from the porch and walked toward them with a measured gait. As he drew closer, Sarah could make out more details. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of aged whiskey. A thin scar ran along his left cheekbone, giving him a roguish appearance. "I am making it my concern," he said evenly, "so I will ask again. How much is her fare to Salt Lake City?" Griggs hesitated, clearly sizing up whether this stranger was worth antagonizing. Something in the cowboy's steady gaze must have convinced him to answer. $6. The stranger reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. He counted out bills with deliberate care, then held them out. "Here is $12. I am paying double. She rides with me." The crowd that had gathered murmured with interest. Sarah stared at the stranger in shock, unable to find words. Who was this man? Why would he help her? Griggs's face went through several interesting contortions. His eyes darted from the money to the stranger to Sarah and back again. Greed warred with stubbornness across his features. "That seat is reserved," he tried weakly. "For whom?" the stranger asked, echoing Sarah's earlier question. When Griggs did not answer, the cowboy stepped closer. He was not threatening exactly, but there was something in his presence that commanded attention. "Take the money, or explain to your employer why you turned down double fare when the coach has empty seats." "I hear the Overland Stage Company has been struggling financially. I imagine they would be interested to know their drivers are refusing paying customers." Griggs's jaw worked furiously, but after a long moment, he snatched the bills from the stranger's hand. "Fine. But if there is any trouble, both of you are off at the first way station. Money be damned." The stranger touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have been respectful if not for the slight amusement in his eyes. "Understood." He turned to Sarah then, and she saw his expression soften slightly. "Miss, your bag." Sarah realized she was still clutching her carpet bag like a lifeline. Thank you. I do not know what to say." "No need to say anything just yet. Let us get you aboard before Griggs changes his mind." He took her bag with one hand and offered his other arm to help her into the coach. His touch, even through the fabric of her sleeve, sent an unexpected jolt through her. Sarah climbed into the coach, acutely aware of the other passengers' scrutinizing gazes. There were 3 others. An elderly woman with pursed lips and a disapproving expression, a portly man in a merchant's suit who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation, and a younger man, perhaps 20, who seemed more curious than judgmental. The stranger climbed in after her and settled onto the bench seat beside her, placing her carpet bag at their feet. The space was cramped, and his shoulder brushed against hers. Sarah tried to make herself smaller, suddenly overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger and the reality of her situation. Griggs slammed the door harder than necessary and climbed up to the driver's box. Moments later, the coach lurched forward with a crack of the whip and the thunder of hooves. St. George began to fall away behind them, and with it, everything Sarah had ever known. They rode in awkward silence for several minutes. The elderly woman kept shooting disapproving looks at both Sarah and her benefactor. The merchant stared resolutely out the window. The young man eventually pulled out a book and began to read, though Sarah suspected he was not absorbing much given how slowly he turned the pages. Finally, Sarah could bear it no longer. She turned slightly toward the stranger and lowered her voice. "Sir, I must thank you for your kindness, but I cannot accept charity. I will repay you the $6 as soon as I am able. I have a teaching position waiting in Salt Lake City, and once I receive my first wages, no need," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble that she felt as much as heard in the confined space. "Consider it a gift." "I cannot," Sarah insisted. "It would not be proper." He turned to look at her fully for the first time since they had boarded, and Sarah found herself caught in his gaze. His eyes were kind, she realized, despite the hardness around the edges that spoke of difficult experiences. "Then consider it a loan, to be repaid whenever you are able," he said. "No interest, no rush. Does that suit your sense of propriety better?" Sarah nodded, relieved. "Yes, thank you. Might I know the name of my benefactor?" A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Lucas Dalton. Most folks call me Luke." "Sarah Jane Morrison," she replied, then felt her cheeks heat as she realized he had likely heard Griggs's accusations. "Though I suppose you already knew that, or at least knew of my family's reputation." "I know nothing about your family," Luke said honestly. "I arrived in St. George only yesterday, heading north to find work. I saw a lady in distress and a bully refusing her service for no good reason. The rest did not matter." His words sent a wave of warmth through Sarah's chest. She had grown so accustomed to being judged, to seeing doors close before she could even knock, that his simple acceptance felt like water in a desert. "Well, Mr. Dalton, you have my deepest gratitude regardless. Just Luke, please. I am not much for formality." The elderly woman made a noise of disgust. "Young people today have no sense of decorum. A proper young lady would not be traveling alone, nor would she be engaging in familiar conversation with a strange man." Sarah felt her defenses rise immediately, but Luke spoke before she could respond. "A proper gentleman would not eavesdrop on a private conversation, yet here we are," he said mildly, not even looking at the woman. "Perhaps we should all mind our own business and let the journey pass peacefully." The woman's face turned purple, and she opened her mouth to deliver what would surely be a scathing retort, but the portly merchant cut her off. "He has a point, Martha. It is going to be a long trip. Let us not make it longer with bickering." Martha, as the woman was apparently called, snapped her mouth shut and turned to glare out the window with such force that Sarah almost felt sorry for the landscape. The young man with the book glanced up and caught Sarah's eye. He gave her a slight, sympathetic smile before returning to his reading. The hours crawled by. The coach rocked and swayed over the rough territorial roads, sometimes smooth packed earth, other times little more than wheel ruts through wild terrain. The temperature inside the coach climbed steadily despite the canvas coverings over the windows being rolled up to allow for airflow. Dust filtered in constantly, coating everything and everyone in a fine layer of grit. Sarah tried to focus on the landscape passing by, the red rock formations unique to Utah Territory giving way gradually to different terrain as they traveled north. But her mind kept drifting back to the man beside her, Lucas Dalton. Luke. She knew nothing about him except that he had shown her unexpected kindness when she needed it most. He sat quietly, seemingly comfortable with the silence, occasionally adjusting his position when the road got particularly rough, but otherwise still as stone. What kind of man did such a thing? Paid double to ensure a stranger could travel. In Sarah's experience, most men fell into one of two categories: those like her father, full of grand promises and empty pockets, or those like Griggs, small-minded and cruel. Luke seemed to fit neither mold. As the afternoon wore on, they stopped briefly at a way station to change horses. The passengers were allowed to disembark and stretch their legs, use the facilities, and purchase food if they desired. Sarah had packed a small lunch of bread and cheese, but the heat had made her more thirsty than hungry. Luke appeared at her elbow as she studied the station, trying to decide if she could afford to spare a few pennies for water. "The water here is free," he said, nodding toward a pump near the side of the building. "Food costs, but water does not." "Thank you," Sarah said, grateful for the information. She made her way to the pump, worked the handle until cool water gushed forth, and drank deeply from her cupped hands. It tasted slightly metallic but was blessedly cold. When she finished and wiped her mouth with her handkerchief, she found Luke filling a canteen from the same pump. He secured the cap and then, to her surprise, held it out to her. "Take it," he said at her hesitation. "It is going to get hotter before we reach the next station. You should have water with you." "But what about you?" He reached into his saddlebag, which apparently had been stowed on the coach, and produced a second canteen. "I came prepared." Sarah accepted the canteen with another murmured thanks, adding it to the growing list of kindnesses she owed this man. She was beginning to feel like a charity case, which pricked at her pride, but she also was not foolish enough to refuse help she genuinely needed. They reboarded the coach along with the other passengers. Griggs glared at them from the driver's box but said nothing. As they lurched back into motion, Sarah tried to settle in for the long afternoon ahead. She must have dozed off at some point because she woke suddenly to the coach lurching violently to one side. Her head had been resting against Luke's shoulder, she realized with embarrassment, and his arm had somehow moved to brace her, preventing her from being thrown across the coach. "What is happening?" the merchant asked nervously. Luke was already looking out the window, his body tense in a way it had not been before. "We have stopped." "Why?" Martha demanded. "We should not reach the next way station until after dark." Before anyone could answer, Griggs's voice called down from above. "Everyone stay calm. We have got a situation here." Luke's hand moved to the gun at his hip in a gesture so subtle Sarah almost missed it. His eyes met hers briefly and she saw a warning there. "Stay quiet. Stay calm." The door to the coach swung open, but it was not Griggs who stood there. Instead, two men with bandanas covering the lower halves of their faces peered in, both armed with revolvers. "Everyone out, nice and slow," one of them ordered. "Keep your hands where we can see them." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. Road agents. She had heard stories, of course, but had never imagined experiencing such a thing herself. Luke moved first, stepping down from the coach with his hands held away from his body, making no sudden movements. He turned and offered his hand to help Sarah down, his expression carefully neutral, but she could feel the tension in his grip. The other passengers followed. In total, there were 4 bandits, all armed. Griggs sat on the driver's box with his hands raised, his earlier bluster completely deflated. The strongbox that typically held mail and valuables had already been opened and emptied, its contents distributed among the thieves' saddlebags. "Now then," the apparent leader of the group said, his voice carrying an accent Sarah could not quite place. "We will be collecting your valuables, jewelry, money, watches. Hand them over peacefully and nobody gets hurt. Cause trouble and, well, I reckon you can figure out the alternative." Martha immediately began protesting. "This is outrageous. We are decent people. You cannot—" The bandit swung his gun toward her casually. "Lady, I surely can. Now shut your mouth and hand over that necklace before I decide it is not worth the trouble to leave witnesses." Martha's hand flew to her throat where a modest pearl necklace rested. She fumbled with the clasp, her fingers shaking. The bandits moved down the line of passengers. The young man with the book surrendered a pocket watch that looked like it might have been a family heirloom based on the way his jaw clenched as he handed it over. The merchant emptied his wallet, a considerable sum that made the bandits whistle appreciatively. When they reached Sarah, she opened her small purse and held it out. "I have $3.20. It is all I have in the world." One of the bandits snatched the purse and peered inside, then snorted. "Pathetic. No jewelry, nothing else." "No, sir," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Then they turned to Luke. "You, empty your pockets. Hand over the gun too, nice and slow." Luke reached carefully into his vest and withdrew his wallet. He held it out without opening it. About $40 cash. You are welcome to count it. I surely will, the leader said, taking the wallet. He rifled through it, nodded in satisfaction, then fixed Luke with a hard stare. The gun. I would rather not, Luke said calmly. The atmosphere shifted immediately. All four bandits tensed, their weapons coming up. The leader stepped closer, pressing the barrel of his revolver against Luke's chest. That was not a request, friend. I understand, Luke said, still in that same calm tone that somehow made Sarah's heart beat even faster. But that gun belonged to my father. It has sentimental value beyond its worth in cash. You have already taken my money. I am asking you to leave me the gun. Sarah held her breath. What was he doing? It was just a gun. His life was worth more than a piece of metal, no matter whose it had been. The bandit leader studied Luke for a long moment. Sarah could not see his expression behind the bandana, but she could feel the weight of his consideration. Your daddy's gun, huh? He finally said. Fine, keep it. But you so much as twitch in a way I do not like, and I will put a bullet in you and the pretty lady beside you. Understood? Understood, Luke agreed. The bandits finished their robbery, taking the horses from the team pulling the coach, leaving only two so the coach could limp slowly to the next station. Then they mounted up and rode off in a cloud of dust, whooping and hollering like this was all a grand adventure. As soon as they were out of sight, Martha collapsed against the side of the coach, fanning herself dramatically. The merchant was already complaining to Griggs about the lack of security and demanding to know how the company planned to compensate him for his losses. Luke turned to Sarah, his hands settling gently on her shoulders. Are you hurt? No, she managed, though she was shaking. I am fine, just frightened. That is a natural response, he said. His thumbs rubbed small circles against her shoulders, a comforting gesture that helped ground her. You did well, stayed calm, did as they asked. That was smart. You risked your life for a gun, she said, the fear transmuting into something like anger now that the danger had passed. What if he had shot you? He was not going to shoot me. You could not have known that. Luke's expression softened. I knew. Men like that, they talk big, but they are not killers unless they have to be. Real killers do not announce themselves or make threats. They just act. I have met both kinds. I know the difference. His words raised a dozen questions in Sarah's mind. What exactly was Luke's past that he could make such distinctions? But before she could ask, Griggs was shouting for everyone to board again so they could reach the next way station before full dark. The atmosphere in the coach was subdued after the robbery. Even Martha had lost her appetite for criticism. They rode in silence, each person absorbed in their own thoughts. Sarah found herself studying Luke in the dying light. He had gone still again, staring out at the darkening landscape, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders that had not been there before. His hand rested near his gun, ready, though he probably was not even conscious of the gesture. You have dealt with bandits before, she said quietly enough that the others would not hear over the rattle of the coach. Once or twice, he admitted, and you have seen men killed. It was not a question, and Luke did not treat it as one. Yes, in the war, Sarah guessed. He would have been young, but perhaps old enough to serve in the final years, among other places. He did not elaborate, and Sarah did not push. Everyone had secrets, especially men of a certain age in the territories. The war had touched almost everyone in some way, leaving scars both visible and hidden. They reached the way station well after dark. It was a rough establishment, little more than a log structure with a barn and a corral, but it offered shelter and food. The passengers were informed they would be staying overnight due to the loss of the horses. Fresh horses would arrive in the morning from a nearby ranch, but until then, They were stuck. The accommodations were basic. The men would sleep in the common room on whatever flat surface they could find. The women were given the station keeper's small bedroom, which meant Sarah would be sharing a single bed with Martha. That promised to be a delightful experience. Dinner was salt pork, beans, and hardtack, served by the station keeper's wife, a tired-looking woman who seemed overwhelmed by the sudden influx of guests. Sarah helped clear the dishes afterward, partly out of habit and partly to feel useful. As she worked, she caught glimpses of Luke through the doorway to the common room. He was in conversation with the young man who had been reading, their heads bent close together. Whatever they were discussing seemed serious, but then Luke said something that made the young man laugh, the tension breaking. When Sarah finished in the kitchen, she stepped outside for a moment, needing air and space after the cramped coach and crowded station. The night was clear and cool, a relief after the heat of the day. Stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet, so many more than she had ever seen in town where lamps and hearth fires dimmed their glow. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Luke approaching. "Cannot sleep yet?" he asked. "We have not tried yet," Sarah said with a slight smile. "Though I confess I am not looking forward to sharing a bed with Martha. I suspect I will hear about all my many failings as a young woman for hours before she allows me any rest." Luke chuckled, a low, warm sound that did pleasant things to Sarah's insides. "She does seem to have opinions." "She is not entirely wrong," Sarah admitted. "A proper young lady would not be traveling alone. I should have a chaperone or a companion, someone to lend me respectability." But there was no one. "My father had no family and my mother's relatives want nothing to do with me after everything. So here I am, alone and improper, relying on the kindness of strangers." "There is no shame in needing help," Luke said. He had moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool night air. "We all need it sometimes. The shame is in those who refuse to offer it when they can." Sarah turned to look at him, this man who had appeared in her life just hours ago and yet had already changed its course. "Why did you help me, Luke? Truly?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the stars. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "My mother traveled alone once when I was a boy. My father had died, and she was trying to get us from Kansas to California where her sister lived. She had me and my younger brother to look after, barely enough money for passage, and no one to help her. The stage drivers looked at her like she was dirt because she was a widow with no man to speak for her. People treated her poorly, took advantage when they could. I never forgot what that was like, watching strangers be cruel to her for no reason except that she was vulnerable." "I am sorry," Sarah said. "That must have been difficult." "It taught me something," Luke continued. "Taught me that the measure of a person is not in how they treat those who can help them, but in how they treat those who cannot. Griggs refused you service not because you could not pay, but because he knew you had no power to fight back. That did not sit right with me." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the physical proximity. She had spent so long being seen as a burden, as a problem to be avoided, that Luke's simple human decency felt revolutionary. "Your mother was lucky to have you," she said. "My mother died 3 years ago," Luke said. "Cholera epidemic in Sacramento. My brother too. I have been drifting since then, picking up work where I can, not really settling anywhere. Nothing felt right, you know, like I was waiting for something, but I did not know what." Without thinking, Sarah reached out and placed her hand on his arm. Through the fabric of his shirt, she could feel the solid muscle beneath, the warmth of living flesh. "I am so sorry for your losses." He looked down at her hand, then up to meet her eyes. In the starlight, his face was all shadows and angles, but his expression was open in a way it had not been before. "Thank you. I do not talk about them much. I am not sure why I told you." "Perhaps because I am a stranger," Sarah suggested. "Sometimes it is easier to share truths with someone who has no history with you, no expectations." "Maybe," Luke agreed, but he did not move away from her touch, and Sarah found she did not want to remove her hand. They stood like that for a moment, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Sarah was acutely aware of the impropriety of the situation. She was unchaperoned with a man she barely knew, touching him in familiar ways that would scandalize Martha and anyone else who might see. But somehow, she could not bring herself to care. "I should go in," she finally said, though she made no move to do so. "Probably," Luke agreed, though he too remained still. "Martha will be waiting and disapproving." "Almost certainly." Sarah laughed softly. "Good night, Luke, and thank you for everything today." "I know I keep saying it, but I truly mean it." "I know you do." "Good night, Sarah." The use of her given name sent a little thrill through her. She reluctantly withdrew her hand and headed back inside, feeling his eyes on her the whole way. Martha was indeed waiting, and she indeed had opinions about young women who lingered outside with strange men. Sarah endured the lecture with as much patience as she could muster, changed into her nightgown behind a makeshift privacy screen, and climbed into bed. Martha continued to talk even after they extinguished the lamp. But eventually, exhaustion claimed Sarah, and she drifted into sleep despite the older woman's droning. She dreamed of the robbery, except in the dream, the bandit shot Luke, and Sarah watched helplessly as he fell. She woke with a gasp, her heart racing, to find pale dawn light seeping through the cracks in the shutters. Martha was still asleep, snoring softly. Sarah carefully extricated herself from the bed and dressed as quietly as possible. She needed air, needed to shake off the lingering unease of the dream. Outside, the way station was beginning to stir. The station keeper's wife was already at work preparing breakfast. In the corral, fresh horses had arrived and the station keeper was checking them over. Griggs stood nearby, smoking a cigarette and looking surly. Sarah found Luke around the side of the building, stripped to his undershirt, washing at a water trough. She froze, knowing she should turn away, give him privacy, but found herself unable to move. His back was to her, and she could see the play of muscles beneath tanned skin, the way water sluiced down his spine. There were scars too, pale lines that told stories she suspected he would never share. As if sensing her presence, he turned, water dripping from his hair and face. Their eyes met, and Sarah felt heat flood her cheeks at being caught staring. But Luke did not seem embarrassed or angry. Instead, he smiled, slow and a bit teasing. "Morning," he said. "I apologize, I did not mean to intrude," Sarah stammered. "No intrusion. Give me a moment to make myself presentable." He reached for his shirt, which hung over the fence rail, and shrugged into it. He left it unbuttoned as he walked over to her, still drying his face with a cloth. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "A little." "You? Enough." "I have slept in worse places than a station house floor." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Sarah searched for something to say, anything to fill the space, but her mind had gone blank. The sight of him half-dressed had scattered her thoughts like leaves in a wind. "The horses arrived," she finally managed, "so I see we should be able to continue on soon." "Yes." More silence. Then Luke finished buttoning his shirt and tucked it into his trousers. "Sarah, I have been thinking." "About what?" "About your situation. You said you have a teaching position in Salt Lake City." "Yes, at a girls' school. It is a new institution, founded by a women's education society. They hired me based on my letters and references from the school teacher I assisted in St. George. But you have never been to Salt Lake City." "No." And you do not know anyone there? Sarah frowned, not sure where this was leading. No, I do not, but I will manage. I am resourceful. I am sure you are, Luke said quickly. I did not mean to suggest otherwise, I just… Look, Salt Lake City is a big place, growing fast with all the mining and railroad business. It can be overwhelming, especially for someone arriving alone. I know a few people there, folks I worked with last year when I was hired to break horses for a freight company. If you would like, I could introduce you, help you get settled. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. She had already accepted so much help from this man. She could not continue to be a burden. But the practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her going through the past difficult months, recognized the value of what he was offering. Having connections in a new city, people who could vouch for her, could make all the difference. I would appreciate that, she said carefully. Though I do not wish to impose on your time, I am sure you have your own business to attend to. Nothing that cannot wait a few days, Luke said. Besides, I find I am in no hurry to part ways just yet. The way he said it, the warmth in his eyes, made Sarah's breath catch. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? Or was she reading too much into simple kindness? Before she could respond, the station keeper's wife called out that breakfast was ready. The moment broke, and they headed inside together, though Sarah's mind was spinning. The day's travel was less eventful than the previous days, which everyone seemed grateful for. The new horses were strong and fresh, making good time despite the heat. The landscape gradually shifted, red rock giving way to more varied terrain as they traveled north through Utah territory. Sarah found herself hyper-aware of Luke's presence beside her. Every brush of his arm against hers as the coach swayed sent little sparks through her. She caught him watching her several times, and each time he did not look away when their eyes met. Instead, he smiled, small and private, like they shared a secret. Martha seemed to have exhausted her capacity for criticism because she remained blessedly silent for most of the journey. The merchant read a newspaper he had acquired at the way station. The young man continued with his book, though Sarah noticed he was now much further through it than seemed possible. Perhaps he was rereading sections. They stopped briefly at midday to change horses again and allow passengers to tend to necessities. Sarah used the opportunity to stretch her legs, walking a short distance from the station to look out over the valley spreading below them. They had climbed in elevation, and the air was slightly cooler, though still warm. Luke joined her again, and she was beginning to expect his presence to rely on it even. Beautiful country, he observed. It is, Sarah agreed. I have never traveled much beyond St. George. Everything seems so vast out here. The territories are like that. So much open space it makes a person feel small. Is that why you drift? Because you like the openness? Luke considered the question. Partly. I also drift because I have not found a reason to stop. He looked at her as he said it, and Sarah felt the weight of his gaze, the implication in his words. Her heart began to beat faster. What if you found a reason? She asked softly. Then I suppose I would stop drifting. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Sarah knew she should be cautious. She barely knew this man. He had been kind to her, yes, but kindness did not necessarily mean anything deeper. And yet she felt drawn to him in a way she had never experienced before. We should head back, Luke said finally. They will be ready to leave soon. Sarah nodded, but as they walked back to the station, Luke offered his arm and she took it. It was a small gesture, barely noteworthy, but it felt significant. The afternoon passed much like the morning. Miles rolled by beneath the coach wheels. The sun arced across the sky, beginning its descent toward evening. Sarah dozed intermittently, her head drooping toward Luke's shoulder before she caught herself. The third time it happened, she felt him shift, adjusting his position so she could rest more comfortably. And she gave in, allowing herself to sleep. She woke as the coach was rolling into a larger way station, this one almost a small town in its own right. The station keeper informed them they would stay here for the night again, as they did not travel the final leg into Salt Lake City after dark due to increased bandit activity. That evening's accommodations were slightly better. There was an actual inn attached to the way station, with proper rooms, though they were still required to share. Sarah found herself assigned to a room with Martha again, but at least this time they each had their own narrow bed. Dinner was served in a common dining room, and the food was a significant improvement over the previous night's fare. There was roasted chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and even a simple berry pie for dessert. Sarah savored every bite, realizing just how hungry she had been. After dinner, several of the guests lingered in the common room. Someone had a fiddle, and soon music filled the air. A few locals from the surrounding area had come in, attracted by the company and the entertainment. Someone suggested dancing, and space was cleared. Sarah watched from the sidelines, her foot tapping along with the lively tune. She had always loved to dance, but there had been few opportunities in recent years. After her father's death, social invitations had dried up entirely. "Dance with me." She turned to find Luke beside her, his hand extended. "I am not sure that is appropriate," she said, though her heart leaped at the invitation. "Probably not," Luke agreed with a slight smile. "But when has that stopped us so far?" Sarah laughed and placed her hand in his. He led her to the makeshift dance floor, and as the fiddle struck up a new tune, he swept her into the pattern. He was a good dancer, confident without being showy, and he led well. Sarah relaxed into the movement, letting the music carry her. They danced one song, then another. By the third, Sarah was breathless and laughing, all the stress and fear of the past days melting away. When the music finally slowed to a more sedate tune, Luke pulled her closer than was strictly proper, and Sarah did not protest. "You are a good dancer," she said. "My mother insisted I learn." She said a man should know how to move on a dance floor if he ever wanted to attract a worthwhile woman. "Your mother sounds like she was wise." She was. They swayed together, and Sarah felt the eyes of the other guests on them. Martha was certainly watching with her perpetual disapproval. But Sarah found she could not bring herself to care. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt happy, light, like the weight of the world had lifted from her shoulders. When the song ended, Luke escorted her back to the sidelines. "Thank you for the dance," he said formally, but his eyes were warm. "Thank you for asking," Sarah replied. The evening wound down eventually. Guests began drifting to their rooms. Sarah reluctantly bid Luke good night and headed upstairs with Martha, who wasted no time in expressing her opinion about young women who made spectacles of themselves dancing with strange men. "You are going to ruin what little reputation you have left," Martha warned. "Mark my words, behavior like that will follow you." "I appreciate your concern," Sarah said, keeping her voice level, "but I am quite capable of managing my own affairs." "Clearly not, or you would not be in the situation you are in." The words stung, primarily because there was truth in them. Sarah had not managed her father's affairs before his death, had not even known the extent of his debts until creditors came calling. She had been naive, trusting, and she had paid for it. But she was learning. She was taking control of her life, making her own choices. And if one of those choices was to dance with a handsome cowboy who made her heart race, well, that was her decision to make. She changed into her nightgown in silence, ignoring Martha's continued lecturing, and climbed into bed. But sleep was elusive. Her mind kept replaying the evening, The feel of Luke's hand on her waist, the warmth in his eyes, the way he had held her just a touch closer than necessary. What was happening between them? Was it simply proximity and circumstance, or was it something more? Sarah had little experience with men and romance. Her father had kept her close, claiming she was too precious to waste on local boys who had no prospects. Now she wondered if he had simply been afraid of losing his housekeeper. She thought about Luke's story of his mother, the pain in his voice when he spoke of losing his family. He understood loss, understood struggle. Perhaps that was part of what drew her to him. He did not judge her for her circumstances because he had faced his own difficulties. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps she was simply attracted to him, to his kindness and strength, his quiet confidence and gentle humor. Perhaps it did not need to be more complicated than a man and a woman finding connection in unexpected circumstances. With those thoughts swirling through her mind, Sarah finally drifted to sleep. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Their final day of travel stretched ahead, and Sarah felt a curious mix of anticipation and reluctance. She was eager to reach Salt Lake City, to begin her new life, but she was also not ready to say goodbye to Luke. They set out just after dawn, and the landscape changed noticeably as they drew closer to their destination. More settlements appeared, more signs of civilization. The roads improved. They passed farms and ranches, saw cattle grazing in fields. Luke pointed out landmarks, narrating their journey. He knew this territory well, she realized, better than he had initially let on. He told her about the history of the region, the Mormon pioneers who had settled here, the challenges they had faced. "You know a lot about this place," Sarah observed. "I spent the better part of a year here, like I mentioned," Luke said. "Long enough to learn its stories. The people here, they have carved out something remarkable in difficult circumstances. I respect that." As the day wore on and Salt Lake City grew closer, Sarah felt her anxiety increasing. She clutched her carpetbag tighter, going over her plans in her head. She had the address of the school where she was expected. She had enough money left after the robbery for perhaps a week's lodging at a modest boarding house. She would need to make her first wages stretch, but she could manage. She had to manage. "You are worried," Luke observed. Sarah realized she had been chewing her lower lip, a nervous habit. "I suppose I am. It is one thing to plan for a new life from a distance. It is another to actually arrive and face it." "You are going to do fine," Luke said with certainty. "How can you be sure?" "Because you are smart, resourceful, and determined. You have survived things that would break lesser people. A new teaching job in a growing city. That is nothing compared to what you have already overcome." His faith in her was both comforting and terrifying. What if she failed? What if the position was not what she expected? What if she could not manage on her own? But she had no choice except to try. There was no going back to St. George, no other opportunities waiting. This was her chance, and she would make the most of it. They reached Salt Lake City in the late afternoon. The coach rumbled down increasingly busy streets, past buildings both grand and humble, past people going about their daily business. The city was larger than Sarah had imagined, sprawling and energetic. The coach pulled up to the Overland Stage Company depot, and Griggs announced their arrival with evident relief. He had barely spoken to Sarah or Luke since the robbery, apparently still bitter about being forced to allow her passage. The passengers disembarked. Sarah stood on the wooden sidewalk, clutching her carpetbag, suddenly overwhelmed by the bustle around her. Freight wagons rumbled past. Merchants called out their wares. A group of miners, fresh from the mountains, laughed loudly as they headed toward a saloon. Luke appeared at her side, his own bag slung over his shoulder. "Where is this school of yours?" Sarah dug out the letter she had received, the one offering her the position, and read the address. Franklin Girls Academy on 4th East Street. I know where that is. Come on, I will walk you there. You do not have to. I know I do not have to. I want to. Now come on before you get swallowed up by the crowd. He offered his arm, and Sarah took it gratefully. She had not realized just how much the noise and chaos of the city would affect her after growing up in a small town. They walked through the streets, Luke navigating with the confidence of someone familiar with the layout. He pointed out useful places as they went: a good mercantile for supplies, a doctor's office, a reputable boarding house. "How do you know all this?" Sarah asked. "I told you I spent time here last year." "I also asked around this morning while you were sleeping, got updated information on what is where these days." "You did that for me, of course." His simple acceptance of helping her, with no expectation of anything in return, continued to amaze Sarah. She had spent so long dealing with people who wanted something from her, who helped only if there was benefit to them, that Luke's genuine kindness felt almost foreign. They found Franklin Girls Academy without difficulty. It was a large house that had been converted for educational purposes, painted a respectable white with green trim. A sign hung by the gate, and through the windows, Sarah could see what looked like classrooms. "This is it," she said, her stomach fluttering with nerves. "Would you like me to come in with you?" Luke asked. Sarah was tempted to say yes, but she knew she needed to do this on her own. This was her future, her opportunity. She needed to stand on her own feet. "No, but thank you, I need to do this myself." Luke nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I will be staying at the Salt Lake Hotel on Main Street. If you need anything at all, come find me. I will repay you the $6 as soon as I receive my wages," Sarah promised. "Sarah, that is not what I am concerned about. I know, but it matters to me." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but the offer stands. If you need help, I am here." Sarah realized this was goodbye, at least for now. The thought made her chest tight. "Luke, I thank you for everything. I do not know what would have happened if you had not helped me." "You would have found a way," Luke said confidently. "You are stronger than you give yourself credit for." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, neither quite wanting to part ways. Finally, Luke reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "Good luck, Sarah Jane." "Goodbye, Luke." She watched him walk away, his tall frame disappearing into the crowd. Then she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked through the gate to her future. The woman who answered her knock introduced herself as Miss Patricia Hartford, the head mistress of the academy. She was perhaps in her 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She welcomed Sarah warmly, clearly relieved that her new teacher had arrived safely. "We were beginning to worry," Miss Hartford said, leading Sarah through the building. "Your letter said you would arrive yesterday." "There were some delays on the journey," Sarah explained, not elaborating on the robbery or the drama with Griggs. Miss Hartford showed her the classrooms, explained the curriculum, and introduced her to the 3 other teachers who worked at the academy. Everyone seemed pleasant and professional, and Sarah felt some of her anxiety easing. Her living quarters were on the 3rd floor, a small but clean room with a bed, a desk, a wardrobe, and a window overlooking the street. It was more than Sarah had dared hope for. "You start tomorrow," Miss Hartford said. "You will be teaching literature and composition to our older students, ages 14 to 17. We also expect all teachers to supervise study hours and occasionally help with younger students as needed." "I understand. Thank you for this opportunity, Miss Hartford. I will not disappoint you." "I am sure you will not. Your references were excellent. Now you must be exhausted from your journey. Why do not you rest this evening, and we will see you bright and early tomorrow?" After Miss Hartford left, Sarah sank onto the bed, suddenly overwhelmed. She had done it. She was here, she had the position, she had a place to live. Everything she had worked toward had come to pass. So why did she feel so empty? She knew the answer, even if she did not want to admit it. Luke. In just 3 days, he had become important to her in a way she had not anticipated. And now he was gone, off to live his own life while she lived hers. That was how it should be, she told herself firmly. They were strangers who had shared a brief journey, nothing more. She needed to focus on her work, on building a life here. She could not afford distractions. But as night fell and Sarah lay in her narrow bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, she could not stop thinking about whiskey-colored eyes and a gentle smile. The first week at Franklin Girls Academy passed in a blur of activity. Sarah threw herself into her work, preparing lessons, getting to know her students and establishing herself as a capable teacher. The girls were bright and eager to learn, and Sarah found genuine joy in teaching them. The other teachers were friendly, particularly Miss Caroline Webster, a fellow young teacher who taught mathematics and sciences. Caroline was close to Sarah's age, with curly red hair and a smattering of freckles across her nose. She took Sarah under her wing, helping her navigate the social dynamics of the school and the city. "You should come to the church social on Saturday," Caroline suggested one afternoon as they supervised the girls' study hour. "It is a good way to meet people, become part of the community." "I am not sure I would be welcome," Sarah said carefully. She had not shared the details of her father's scandal, but she felt the shadow of it nonetheless. "Nonsense. Everyone is welcome. Besides, you cannot work all the time. You need friends, Sarah." Caroline was right, Sarah knew. She was lonely. She missed having someone to talk to share thoughts with. She missed Luke, though she tried not to dwell on that. She had not gone to find him at the Salt Lake Hotel. She had told herself it was because she was too busy, because it would not be appropriate, because she needed to focus on her new life. But the truth was she was afraid. Afraid that what she had felt during their journey had been one-sided, a product of heightened emotions and unusual circumstances. Afraid that if she sought him out, she would seem desperate or clingy. Better to let it remain a pleasant memory than to ruin it by revealing her foolish heart. Saturday came, and Caroline convinced Sarah to attend the church social. Sarah wore her best dress, a simple but flattering blue cotton that brought out her eyes. Caroline lent her a shawl, and they walked together to the church. The social was held in the church hall, a large room decorated with bunting and candles. Tables had been set up with food, and a small musical ensemble played in one corner. People mingled, talking and laughing, and the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. Caroline introduced Sarah to what felt like dozens of people. Teachers from other schools, merchants and their families, young men clearly hoping to meet potential wives. Sarah smiled and made polite conversation, but her heart was not in it. She was standing by the refreshment table, grateful for a moment's respite from socializing, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Fancy meeting you here." Sarah spun around so fast she nearly spilled her punch. Luke stood there, dressed more formally than she had seen him, in a clean white shirt, dark vest, and string tie. He had shaved and his hair was neatly combed, but his eyes held the same warmth she remembered. "Luke," she breathed, "what are you doing here?" "I was invited," he said with a slight smile. "My friend Henry, the one I mentioned who runs the freight company, this is his church. He dragged me along, said I needed to stop moping around my hotel room." "You have been moping," Luke's smile widened. "Maybe a little." Sarah felt a bubble of joy expanding in her chest. "I have been wanting to come find you," she admitted, "but I thought perhaps you would prefer I did not." "Why would I prefer that? I do not know." I suppose I thought that once you had fulfilled your good deed, you would want to move on with your life without a stray teaching girl hanging around." Luke's expression shifted to something more serious. He set down his cup and took her hand, gently tugging her toward a quieter corner of the hall. "Sarah, I have been waiting all week for you to come find me. I would have come to the academy, but I did not want to compromise you or make trouble for you at your new job. But I have been going half mad wondering how you were doing." "Really?" Sarah felt almost lightheaded with relief. "Really? I thought maybe I had misread things between us, that maybe you were just being polite because I helped you. But then Henry told me he saw you walking with Caroline Webster, and she mentioned you to him, and I asked about this social, and here I am." "Here you are," Sarah echoed. They stared at each other for a moment, both seemingly at a loss for words. Then Luke cleared his throat. "Would you like to dance?" "I would like that very much." They moved to the dance floor as the ensemble started a new tune. Luke pulled her into his arms, and Sarah felt like she had come home. They moved together effortlessly, as if they had been dancing together for years instead of just one evening at a way station. "So tell me about your week," Luke said. "How is the teaching?" "Wonderful. Challenging, but wonderful. The girls are bright, and Miss Hartford is a fair administrator. I think I am going to be happy here." "I am glad. What about you? Have you found work?" "Actually, yes. Henry hired me on full time at his freight company. Good wages, steady work. I start Monday." Sarah pulled back slightly to look at him. "You are staying in Salt Lake City. I told you, I drift until I find a reason to stop. I think I found my reason." The way he looked at her as he said it left no doubt about his meaning. Sarah felt heat flood her cheeks. "Luke, you cannot make a decision like that based on someone you barely know." "Who says I barely know you? We spent 3 days in close quarters, faced robbery together, shared stories and dances. I know you are brave and kind and smart. I know you have a terrible habit of chewing your lip when you are nervous. I know you love to dance and that you are passionate about teaching. I know that when you sleep, you make these little sighing sounds that are absolutely adorable." "You did not," Sarah protested, mortified. "I did. On the coach, when you fell asleep on my shoulder, I did not mind." Sarah did not know what to say. Her heart felt too big for her chest. "Luke, I do not want you to give up your freedom for me. If you want to keep drifting to see more of the country—" "I have seen enough of the country," Luke interrupted. "I have spent 3 years wandering, looking for something without knowing what it was. And then I saw a woman being treated unfairly by a bitter man, and I helped her, and somewhere over 3 days of travel, I realized what I had been looking for. It was not a place, it was a person." "You cannot mean that." "Why not?" "Because it is too fast, too sudden. People do not fall in love in 3 days. Do they not?" Luke pulled her a bit closer, lowering his voice. "My parents met and married within 2 weeks. My mother always said when you know. I did not understand what she meant until now." Sarah's breath caught. "Are you saying you love me?" "I am saying I could love you very easily. I am already halfway there, and I would like the chance to see if maybe you could love me too." The music swirled around them. Other dancers moved past, but Sarah was only aware of Luke, of his arms around her, his eyes searching hers. "I could," she whispered. "Love you, I mean. I think I already do, a little." Luke's face broke into a grin that transformed him from handsome to devastating. "Then what are we waiting for? Propriety, common sense. The fact that everyone will think we are mad. Let them think what they want. Life is too short and too uncertain to waste time pretending we do not feel what we feel." He had a point. Sarah had spent months trapped by other people's opinions, by scandal and shame that was not hers to bear. Maybe it was time to stop letting fear dictate her choices. "All right," she said, "but we should take things slowly, court properly." You can call on me at the academy, and we can attend socials together, and we can see how we suit." "I can agree to that," Luke said, "though I already know how we suit. Nevertheless, I will not have anyone saying I behaved improperly or that I threw myself at the first man who showed me kindness." "Fair enough. I will court you properly, Sarah Jane Morrison. I will be a gentleman and I will win your heart, and then when enough time has passed that everyone agrees we have been sensible about it, I am going to marry you." Sarah laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. "That is quite a plan. I am a man who knows what he wants." The song ended, and they were forced to separate as other couples shifted around them. Caroline appeared at Sarah's elbow, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Well, well, you have been holding out on me. Who is this handsome gentleman?" Sarah made introductions, and Caroline immediately approved. "Any friend of Henry's is welcome in our circle. You should both join us for dinner next week. I will arrange it." Before Sarah could protest that it might be too soon, Caroline had whisked off to organize, leaving Sarah and Luke standing together. "Is she always like that?" Luke asked, amused. "I have only known her a week, but yes, I believe she is." They spent the rest of the evening together, though they made an effort to socialize with others to avoid being too obvious about their attachment. But Sarah was constantly aware of where Luke was in the room, and every time their eyes met, she felt that spark of connection. When the social ended, Luke offered to walk her and Caroline back to the academy. Caroline chattered the whole way, giving them little chance for private conversation, but when they reached the gate, she tactfully went inside, claiming she needed to check on something. "She is not subtle," Sarah observed, "but well-meaning," Luke said. He took both her hands in his. "I meant what I said tonight, all of it. I know, and I meant what I said too. I will come calling on Wednesday if that is all right. I believe that is your afternoon off." "How did you know that?" Luke had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "I may have asked Caroline before tonight. I wanted to know when I could see you." Sarah shook her head, but she was smiling. "Wednesday would be lovely. Good. I will take you to dinner somewhere nice. Wear that blue dress again. It brings out your eyes. You are very forward, Mr. Dalton." "I thought we were past formality, Miss Morrison." Sarah rose up on her toes and pressed a quick, chaste kiss to his cheek. "Good night, Luke." She hurried through the gate before she could see his reaction, her heart pounding, her face flushed. She felt giddy and reckless and more alive than she had in years. Behind her, she heard Luke's soft laughter and his voice calling after her. "Good night, Sarah. Dream of me." She did dream of him that night and for many nights after. True to his word, Luke began courting Sarah properly. He called on Wednesday, taking her to a nice restaurant where they talked for hours. He came to church socials and invited her to picnics and community events. He was a perfect gentleman, never pressing for more than she was willing to give, always respectful of her position and reputation. But the connection between them only deepened. Sarah found herself sharing things with Luke that she had never told anyone. Her fears about her father's legacy, her worries about being enough, her dreams for the future. Luke listened with genuine interest and shared his own stories in return. He told her about his childhood in Kansas, about the long journey to California, about the difficult years after the war when he had drifted from place to place looking for purpose. He told her about his work breaking horses, about close calls with outlaws and harsh winters. He made her laugh with stories of mishaps and misadventures. They became a known couple in their social circle. Caroline approved heartily, as did Henry and his wife Martha, who was not related to the disagreeable Martha from the Stagecoach. Miss Hartford also seemed pleased, commenting that Sarah seemed happier and more settled since meeting Luke. The weeks turned into months. Fall arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the changing of leaves. Sarah's first wages came, and she proudly paid Luke back the $6 from the Stagecoach fare. He accepted it with good grace, though he immediately used it to buy her a bouquet of flowers. On a crisp October evening, 3 months after they had met, Luke took Sarah for a walk along the outskirts of town. They climbed a small hill that overlooked the valley, watching as the sun set in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Sarah, I have something to ask you," Luke said, taking her hands. Sarah's heart began to race. "Yes, I know we agreed to take things slowly. I know it has only been 3 months, but I have known how I felt about you since that first day in St. George when I saw you refusing to back down despite having every reason to. I love you, Sarah Jane Morrison. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you light up when you talk about your students. I love how you sing softly to yourself when you think no one is listening. I love everything about you, and I do not want to spend another day without knowing you will be mine forever." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out a small box. He opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small, modest diamond. "It is not much, but it is honest, bought with wages I earned doing work I am proud of. Sarah, will you marry me?" Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Luke, of course I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger and then he kissed her, really kissed her for the first time. It was sweet and gentle and full of promise, and Sarah felt like her heart might burst from happiness. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I am going to make you so happy," he promised. "You already do," Sarah said. They were married in November on a cold, clear day with snow threatening in the clouds. Caroline served as Sarah's bridesmaid, and Henry stood up as Luke's best man. Miss Hartford attended, along with many of the teachers from the academy and friends from their church. It was a small wedding but filled with warmth and joy. Sarah wore a simple white dress that Caroline had helped her sew. Luke wore his best suit, and when he saw Sarah walking down the aisle, the look on his face made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. They exchanged vows in front of God and their community, promising to love and honor each other all their days. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife and Luke kissed her, Sarah felt like her life had finally truly begun. They had saved enough for a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but theirs. Luke had been working hard at the freight company and had already been promoted to foreman. Between his wages and Sarah's teaching salary, they were comfortable, not wealthy but secure. Their wedding night was tender and sweet. Luke was patient with Sarah's inexperience, gentle and caring. They came together as husband and wife, and Sarah felt a completeness she had not known was missing. In the morning, wrapped in Luke's arms, watching the dawn light creep across the ceiling, Sarah marveled at how much her life had changed. Less than 6 months ago, she had been alone and desperate, refused passage on a stagecoach, facing an uncertain future. Now she was married to a wonderful man, had meaningful work she loved, and was building a life that was truly hers. "What are you thinking about?" Luke murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "How lucky I am," Sarah said. "How different things could have been." "Not luck," Luke said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Fate. We were meant to find each other." "Do you really believe that?" "I do. Everything I went through, all the loss and wandering, it led me to that street in St. George on that exact day when you needed help." "How could that be anything but fate?" Sarah smiled and snuggled closer. "Then I suppose I am grateful to fate." "Me too, Mrs. Dalton. Me too." The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. Sarah continued teaching, though it was unusual for a married woman to do so. Some in the community disapproved, but Miss Hartford supported her, and Sarah was too valuable as a teacher to lose. They navigated learning to live together, to compromise and communicate. There were disagreements, of course. Luke could be stubborn, and Sarah had a tendency to bottle up her worries rather than share them. But they learned to talk through their problems, to be honest with each other even when it was difficult. Luke's work at the freight company continued to go well. He was respected by the men he supervised and trusted by Henry. The business grew, and with it, Luke's responsibilities and wages increased. Sarah thrived in her teaching position. She developed a reputation as an excellent instructor, and enrollment at the academy grew. She particularly loved working with the older girls, helping them discover literature and express themselves through writing. In their second year of marriage, Sarah discovered she was expecting a child. The news filled them both with joy and terror. Luke fretted over her constantly, trying to prevent her from doing anything strenuous. Sarah found his concern endearing even when it was frustrating. She continued teaching through her 6th month, then reluctantly stepped back to prepare for the baby's arrival. Caroline took over her classes temporarily, and Sarah spent her days sewing baby clothes and preparing their small house for its new occupant. Their son was born on a warm August evening, almost exactly 2 years after Sarah had first arrived in Salt Lake City. The labor was long and difficult, and Luke wore a path in the floor with his pacing, but when he finally held his son, tears streaming down his face, Sarah knew every moment of pain had been worth it. They named him James Lucas Dalton, after Luke's father. James had dark hair like his father and bright, curious eyes that already seemed to take in everything around him. Parenthood changed them both. Luke was a devoted father, gentle and patient with his son. He would come home from long days at work and immediately take James, rocking him and singing soft lullabies that his own mother had sung. Sarah discovered a fierce protective love she had not known she was capable of. Every milestone James reached filled her with pride. His first smile, his first laugh, his first word, which was of course "da," to Luke's delight and Sarah's mock indignation. They had less money now with Sarah not teaching, but somehow they managed. Luke took on extra work when he could, and Sarah was frugal with their household budget. They might not have luxuries, but they had what mattered most: each other and their son. When James was 2, Sarah returned to teaching part-time. They hired a local woman to watch James during the hours Sarah worked. It was a difficult balance, but Sarah found she was happier and more fulfilled having both her family and her work. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Luke continued advancing at the freight company, eventually becoming a partner in the business. Their financial situation improved, and they were able to move to a larger house with room for their growing family. A daughter arrived 3 years after James, a tiny perfect girl they named Elizabeth Marie. She had Sarah's coloring and Luke's stubborn determination. From the moment she could crawl, she was exploring, getting into everything, keeping them constantly on their toes. James adored his little sister, though he pretended to be annoyed by her. Sarah would often find him reading to her or carefully showing her his treasures, his young voice serious as he explained things. Another son followed 2 years later, Robert Marcus, named after Sarah's father. Luke had suggested it, saying that whatever Marcus's failings had been, he had raised a remarkable daughter, and that deserved to be remembered. Sarah cried when Luke proposed the name, touched by his generosity of spirit. Their house was full of noise and love and chaos. Luke proved to be an excellent father, firm but fair, always ready with a story or a game. Sarah marveled at how natural he was with their children, how patient. "You were meant to be a father," she told him one evening after they had finally gotten all 3 children to sleep. "I was meant to be their father," Luke corrected, pulling her into his lap. Just like I was meant to be your husband, still believing in fate, Sarah teased, always, especially when fate has been so good to me. The years continued to pass. The children grew. James became serious and studious, interested in engineering and how things worked. Elizabeth was wild and adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring. Robert was the peacemaker, gentle and empathetic, often mediating between his siblings. Sarah eventually became headmistress of Franklin Girls' Academy when Miss Hartford retired. It was a role she took seriously, working to expand the curriculum and ensure every girl who wanted an education could receive one. Luke and Henry's freight company expanded throughout Utah Territory and beyond. They hired more men, bought more wagons, secured contracts with mines and merchants. Luke was proud of what they had built, of providing good, honest work for families in the community. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Luke surprised Sarah with a trip, just the two of them, leaving the children with Caroline and her husband. They traveled back to St. George, retracing the route of that fateful stagecoach journey. They stood on the street where they had first met, the spot where Luke had stepped forward to help a desperate young woman. The town had grown some, but it was still recognizable. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had not been there that day?" Luke asked. "Sometimes," Sarah admitted. "I like to think I would have found another way, but I do not know. You changed the course of my life, Luke. You gave me a chance when no one else would. You gave me a reason to stop drifting," Luke said. "Before you, I was just going through the motions, not really living. You made me want to build a life, to put down roots." They visited the spot where they had been robbed, laughing now at the memory, though it had been terrifying at the time. They stayed at the way station where they had danced for the first time, though it had changed hands and been renovated. On the journey back to Salt Lake City, sitting in a much more comfortable private coach than the one they had shared years ago, Sarah leaned against her husband's shoulder and reflected on how much had changed. She was no longer the desperate young woman with nothing to her name but a teaching certificate and hope. She was successful, respected, a wife and mother. She had built a life beyond anything she had imagined that day when Griggs had refused her passage. "What are you thinking?" Luke asked, the same question he had asked her countless times over the years. "That I am grateful," Sarah said, "for everything. For you, for our children, for the life we have built together, even for the hard times because they made the good times sweeter." "I am grateful too," Luke said. "Every single day I wake up grateful that I happened to be in St. George that morning, that I saw you and made the choice to help. Best $12 I ever spent." Sarah laughed. "You still remember that?" "I remember everything about that day. The way you stood up to Griggs even though you were terrified. The relief on your face when I offered to pay. The way you looked at me like you could not quite figure out why I was helping. I fell a little bit in love with you right then, though I did not know it yet." "I was so overwhelmed," Sarah recalled, "and suspicious. I kept waiting for you to reveal some ulterior motive to demand something in return. And I never did." "No, you never did. You just kept being kind, kept showing up, kept choosing me. You still do every day." Luke kissed the top of her head. "It is not a hard choice. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah Dalton." They arrived home to chaos, their 3 children having apparently run Caroline and her husband ragged during their absence. But it was the good kind of chaos, the kind that came from a house full of love and life. The years continued their steady march. The children grew into teenagers, then young adults. James went east to study engineering at a university. Elizabeth shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to be a doctor, an almost unheard of ambition for a woman, but with Sarah and Luke's support, she pursued it fiercely. Robert decided to follow in his father's footsteps in the freight business. Sarah and Luke found themselves alone again in their house. The children launched into their own lives. It was an adjustment, but not an unwelcome one. They had more time for each other, rediscovering the quiet companionship of their early marriage. They took walks in the evenings, holding hands like young sweethearts. They read together in their sitting room, comfortable in companionable silence. They made love with the enthusiasm of newlyweds and the skill of longtime partners who knew each other's bodies and hearts intimately. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration. Friends and family gathered, filling their home and spilling into the garden. James had come home from his engineering firm in Chicago, taking time off specifically for the occasion. Elizabeth had traveled from San Francisco, where she was completing her medical training. Robert was there with his new wife, a lovely young woman named Grace. Speeches were made, toasts offered. Caroline, older now but still spirited, shared embarrassing stories from the early days of Sarah and Luke's courtship. Henry and his wife talked about what a good partnership looked like, pointing to Sarah and Luke as an example. When it was time for Sarah and Luke to speak, they stood together, Luke's arm around his wife's waist. 25 years ago, Luke began, I was a drifter with no direction and no hope. I had lost everyone I loved, and I did not think I deserved to find happiness again. Then I saw a young woman being treated unfairly, and something in me said, help her, so I did. And it changed my life. 25 years ago, Sarah continued, I was alone and afraid, facing an uncertain future. I had been beaten down by circumstances beyond my control, and I was running out of hope. Then a stranger stepped forward and showed me kindness for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. He did not know me. He had no obligation to help, but he did anyway, and it changed my life. They looked at each other, and Sarah saw the same love in Luke's eyes that had been there on their wedding day, perhaps deeper now, enriched by years of shared experiences. We have built something beautiful together, Luke said. 3 amazing children, a life filled with love and purpose, a partnership that has weathered every storm. And it all started with a simple choice to be kind. So if there is any wisdom we can offer, Sarah said, addressing the crowd but looking at her children, it is this: choose kindness. Choose to help even when it is not easy or convenient. Choose to see the humanity in others, because you never know when that simple choice might change everything. The crowd applauded, and their children came forward for embraces. James whispered, "Thank you for showing us what love looks like." Elizabeth said, "You set an impossible standard, but I am glad to try to live up to it." Robert simply hugged them both tightly, too emotional for words. As the celebration continued around them, Sarah and Luke slipped away for a moment of privacy in their garden. The November evening was cold, and Sarah shivered until Luke wrapped his coat around her shoulders. 25 years, she marveled. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. Are you happy? Luke asked. Truly happy? I am so happy I sometimes fear I will wake up and find it was all a dream, that I am still that frightened girl in St. George, and none of this is real. It is real, Luke assured her, and you have earned every bit of happiness you have found. You worked hard, you built a life through your own efforts. I just provided a little help at the right moment. You provided more than a little help, Luke. You gave me everything. And you gave me a reason to live instead of just exist, so I would say we are even. They stood together in the garden, listening to the sounds of celebration from inside their house, the voices of their children and friends, the evidence of a life well lived. The stars above them were the same stars that had shone on that night so many years ago when they had stood outside a way station and begun to fall in love. If you could go back, Luke asked, Knowing everything that would happen, would you change anything? Sarah considered the question seriously. There had been hard times, certainly. Financial struggles in the early years, the challenges of balancing work and family, the heartbreak of watching their children face their own difficulties and being unable to shield them. But all of it had been worth it to arrive at this moment. Not a single thing, she said firmly. Every challenge made us stronger. Every struggle brought us closer. Even the painful moments were part of the journey that led us here. Not even the robbery, Luke teased. Sarah laughed. Well, maybe I would skip the robbery. That was genuinely terrifying. Agreed, though it did make for a good story. They returned to the celebration eventually, to their children and friends, to the life they had built together. As the evening wore on and guests began to depart, Sarah found herself reflecting on how fortunate she was. She had started with nothing, had been refused passage and turned away. But one man had seen her worth when others had not. He had paid double and said she rode with him, and in doing so had changed both their lives forever. Years continued to pass in their steady way. Sarah eventually retired from the academy, though she continued to tutor students privately. Luke semi-retired from the freight business, handing over day-to-day operations to Robert while maintaining an advisory role. They became grandparents, first when Elizabeth married a fellow doctor and had a daughter, then when Robert and Grace welcomed twins. James, the eldest, seemed content in his bachelorhood for years, before surprising everyone by marrying a widow with 2 children of her own. Sarah and Luke's house filled with grandchildren during holidays, their voices and laughter breathing new life into the rooms that had been quiet. Luke proved to be an excellent grandfather, patient and playful, always ready with stories of the old days. Sarah loved watching him with the grandchildren, seeing the same gentleness he had shown their own children, the same strength and kindness that had first drawn her to him. Age had touched them both, silver threading through their hair, lines etching their faces, but Luke was still the handsomest man she had ever seen. On their 40th wedding anniversary, they declined a large celebration, preferring instead a quiet dinner with just their immediate family. Their children respected their wishes, though Elizabeth insisted on hosting at her home so Sarah would not have to cook. After dinner, as the grandchildren played under the watchful eyes of their parents, Sarah and Luke sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. 40 years, Luke said, shaking his head. Hard to believe. We have been blessed, Sarah said simply. We have worked hard too, Luke pointed out. Built something worth having through effort and commitment. Both can be true. Luke smiled and took her hand, his thumb tracing over her knuckles, a gesture so familiar after decades together that it was as natural as breathing. Do you remember what I said the night I proposed? That I was going to make you so happy. I remember everything about that night. Do you think I succeeded? Have I made you happy, Sarah? She turned to look at him fully, this man who had been her partner, lover, friend, and companion for 4 decades. His face was dear to her, every line and mark familiar and precious. You have made me happier than I ever dreamed possible, she said honestly. You gave me a family, a purpose, a life filled with love. You supported my work even when it was unconventional. You were a wonderful father to our children. You have been my rock through every storm. So yes, Luke Dalton, you succeeded beyond measure. Good, he said gruffly, emotion thick in his voice. That was always my goal, your happiness. And mine was yours. Have I succeeded too? Every single day, Luke said. You made me believe I deserved good things after I had lost everything. You gave me children when I thought I would die alone. You built a home with me, not just a house but a real home filled with love. You are the best partner I could have imagined." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the sun disappear below the horizon. Inside, they could hear their family, the evidence of the life they had created together. 3 children, all happy and successful. 7 grandchildren, healthy and loved. 40 years of marriage that had weathered every challenge and emerged stronger. "Not bad for a chance meeting on a dusty street in St. George," Sarah observed. "Not bad at all," Luke agreed. "Though I am not sure it was chance. Still holding on to the fate theory, more than ever. We were meant to find each other, Sarah, meant to build this life together. I believe that with everything in me." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, the same gesture she had made countless times over the years, as natural as breathing. "Then I suppose I believe it too, because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." "You will never have to," Luke promised, kissing her forehead. "I am not going anywhere." They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged, the same stars that had witnessed the beginning of their story and had watched over every moment since. Inside, their family waited, the legacy of their love made manifest. Sarah thought back to that girl she had been, desperate and afraid, clutched her carpetbag on a dusty street and faced rejection. She thought about the man who had stepped forward to help, asking for nothing in return, driven simply by the belief that kindness mattered. That single act of generosity had rippled out across decades, creating a life neither of them could have predicted. It had given them each other, given them children and grandchildren, given them a love that had deepened with every passing year. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me that day. For helping when you had no reason to. For paying double and saying I rode with you. For giving me the world." Luke squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for letting me, for taking a chance on a drifter cowboy, for building this life with me, for 40 years of love and partnership." 40 years down," Sarah said with a smile. "How many more do you think we have?" "As many as fate grants us," Luke said. "And I plan to cherish every single one, just like I have cherished all the ones that came before." They went inside eventually, rejoining their family, finishing the evening surrounded by the people they loved most. Later that night, in their own bed in their own home, Sarah lay in Luke's arms and felt complete contentment wash over her. Her life had turned out nothing like she had planned, and everything better than she had imagined. She had faced rejection and hardship, had known loss and fear, but she had also known great love and joy. She had raised wonderful children, had meaningful work that made a difference, and had shared it all with a partner who valued and cherished her. All because a cowboy had seen a woman in need and chosen kindness. All because he had paid double and said she rode with him. That simple moment had been the beginning of everything good in her life. As she drifted toward sleep, warm and safe in her husband's embrace, Sarah sent a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever force had brought them together. Fate, chance, divine providence, whatever it was, she was thankful. And she knew, with the certainty of 4 decades of love, that Luke was right. They had been meant to find each other, meant to build this life together, meant to show their children and grandchildren what real love looked like. It had started on a dusty street in St. George, Utah Territory, on a hot August day in 1875, when a stagecoach driver refused her passage and a cowboy paid double. And it had become a love story for the ages, proof that kindness matters, that taking a chance on someone can change everything, and that sometimes the best things in life begin when a stranger decides to help simply because it is the right thing to do. Their story became legend in their family, passed down through generations. The grandchildren would ask to hear it again and again, how Grandpa Luke had rescued Grandma Sarah, how they had fallen in love on a stagecoach journey, how they had built a life together from nothing. Sarah and Luke lived many more years together, each one a gift, each day another page in their shared story. They grew old together gracefully, their love never diminishing but growing richer and deeper with time. When Luke finally passed, it was peacefully in his sleep, Sarah's hand clasped in his, surrounded by family. He was 83 years old, and he left behind a legacy of kindness, hard work, and love. Sarah lived another 5 years, remaining sharp and engaged until the end. She spent her final years writing down their story, wanting to preserve it for future generations. She wanted her great-grandchildren, and beyond to know that love could begin in the most unexpected ways, that kindness was never wasted, and that sometimes the most important decision you could make was to help someone in need. She passed quietly in the spring, in the house she and Luke had shared for so many years, surrounded by photographs of their life together. Her children were with her, holding her hands, and her last words were of Luke. "Tell your father I am coming," she whispered. "Tell him I will ride with him always." They buried her beside Luke, under a shared headstone that read simply, "Lucas and Sarah Dalton, he paid double." She rode with him. Together they built forever. And in Salt Lake City, in a family that continued to grow and flourish, the story lived on. The story of a cowboy and a teacher, of a chance meeting that became a lifetime, of love that began with a simple act of kindness. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to step forward and say, "She rides with me." One moment of generosity to change the course of 2 lives forever. One decision to choose kindness over indifference, connection over isolation, love over fear. Sarah and Luke's story proved that such moments matter, that they ripple out across generations, that they create legacies that last long after we are gone. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, 2 souls who had found each other on a dusty street in St. George continued their journey together, riding side by side into eternity, just as they always had, just as they always would, forever.